Sorry about that interruption. All right, we're back online.
So to repeat the question, Gina wanted me to explain a little bit about the concept of satellites replacing cables and what the future needs might be. Satellite technology is considered old school. Submarine fiber optic cables are a huge advancement over satellite transmission. When the first cables were laid, they were copper analog cables, and so when they went to satellite, that was a huge increase. It helped quite a bit, but once the laser technology that's in fiber optic cables came about, that really helped the industry in a lot of ways. One, it's faster. If you're my age or older, you remember when you got a call from Europe or Japan or something, there was a long time delay because of the satellite transmission. You'd talk and the person would quit talking, and you know, it would be you could step on each other's voice a lot because there wasn't a clear understanding of the two-way traffic didn't work at the same time. But with fiber optics, it's still traveling at the speed of light. The radio transmissions going to the satellite are at the same speed, the speed of light, but a geosynchronous satellite is so far away from the Earth that the distance up to the satellite and back is what causes that delay. And it's a fraction of that distance when you're just going across the surface of the Earth. So from the longest cable we have off of Oregon goes from Oregon and it goes to Sydney, Australia. We have two actually to do that now. I think the first one had something like a 9-millisecond delay. So small you couldn't tell. It would sound like you're talking to somebody on your cell phone. It's that instantaneous. So the other thing about satellites is they're not secure. If radio signals can be intercepted by anybody with the right equipment. And the third thing is satellites are real expensive to repair. They are still used in areas in Alaska where it isn't easy to lay a cable, either terrestrially or on water, although they actually now have the first fiber optic cable that goes around the North Slope around to Kotzebue. So fiber optic cables are here for now. There may be some technology at some point that will replace them, but at this stage, they are the best technology, far greater capacity than satellites. And the cables that we put in, say in the 2000 era, 2000 to 2010, those most of those cables have been upgraded. The fiber in the actual cable is the same, and the repeater units that are in line in that cable are still the same, but they've changed the boxes on the ends of the cables, the light producing, laser producing boxes. So what happens is if you think of the early days of fiber optics, someone figured they could digitize the signal and send it as pulses of a laser light down a cable. Let's say it's a red laser shooting down the cable, comes out the other end and gets converted back into a voice, an analog voice, and you hear it. Well, then someone decided, well, gee, if we can do that, how about we try to put a red laser and a green laser in the same thing, and we'll sort the colors out at the other end. And it worked. Well, now that same technology is used, only instead of 2 colors of light, it's like 100 different channels of light going through the same single fiber at the same time. So all these frequencies are going in and being split back apart at the opposite end, but the fiber doesn't care. It's just transmitting. So cables now have much more ability to be upgraded. And cables that were several gigabits when they were put in now might be 600 gigabits. They've multiplied exponentially in their capacity. Newest cable the largest cable that's come into Oregon so far was with Microsoft last spring, excuse me, and it was 80 terabits per second. Google had one the year before that was 60 terabits per second. And already they're planning to upgrade theirs, upgrade the boxes to change that 60 to 120 terabits per second. So they're leapfrogging with Microsoft to have the highest capacity. So anyway, I think that explains pretty well that we can expect cables to stay. We don't necessarily we'll expect to see a lot more cables, because as this capacity grows, we have more available bandwidth can pass over a single cable. However, the demand is also growing, so that seems to be what's driving the changes we're seeing. Fill removal law, because the cable is plowed into the seabed, in most cases the fill removal law would apply. And, it's a relatively small amount of cable. The typical plow might have a plowshare that's 8 or 10 inches wide. It creates a berm on the side as it detrenches creates a trench. The cable follows out the bottom of that plow into the bottom of the trench, and then over time it self-fills just with the current. You can see a lot of current on the seabed with the cameras that are on these plows. And so it's just a matter of time before that fills in. If it's real clay type bottom, real stiff, it will take longer. If it's very silty, like closer to shore, or we have grounds we call the Dover grounds, soft mud, they're healed up so quickly that you can't even tell the cable is there without using electronic tools to measure, sort of like a giant metal detector will triangulate how deep the cable is buried, because you can't see the cable or the remnants of the trench. But if you do go through a clay patch, then you will see sort of nice straight walled trenches with sediment at the bottom, and then over time you come back 5 years or 8 years later and you see a little more sediment in that trench, and so it's slowly filling back up. I think they talked a little bit about the pre-application phase and how well this is done in Oregon. I think other states are recognizing this. The cable companies in particular are impressed with the way Oregon handles this, and Oregon, they like the fact that they can know up front in advance everything that's required, and they don't have any surprises that show up partway through the process. So if you want me to elaborate any more on any of these things, please speak up. This looks kind of boring. We'll skip that. Other agencies are involved. The permit that a cable applicant would submit is a joint permit application through the Department of State Lands for the state side and the Army Corps of Engineers on the federal side. So you submit one application. Another very great way to operate when you have the applicant filling out one form for both agencies at one time. Just, Oregon does a lot of things really well in this area.
I think Lauren has a motion.
Pardon me?
Lauren.
I'm sorry, Larry. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the financial implications for the landing sites, why it might be desirable to have them in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most of the cables so far have had, they have what's called a beach manhole. That's where the marine cable starts, is somewhere a beach landing station. And then that cable goes on up to, typically, most of the cables go from the north coast, go into Hillsborough or Portland. The ones on the south coast connect to the backbone of the internet. Google has a cable that lands at Bandon, and there's no real off-ramp on the coast for that cable. It just goes on to their network operations centers in Los Angeles, and part of the traffic goes to Seattle and Portland, and part of it goes south, part of it goes on east. But things are changing. Just very recently, Clatsop County tentatively approved a sale of some county property to a fellow who wants to build a data center in Clatsop County. And one of the components of that is high-speed fiber going from that data center probably to Hillsborough to connect with all the other data centers in the state. Because the main thing with these data centers is you want to be as connected as you can. You need connections to everyone. It's a mesh or a network, so connections everywhere. And so part of it will be a high-capacity cable that will come from Clatsop County into Hillsborough probably. But he's also looking at having fiber coming in from offshore. And there's no particular project yet scheduled, but that's the goal, to have this data center there. If that happens, and even if we don't get the offshore cable, having that data center will create much more opportunities for business in the area of Clatsop County. There could be such things at Pacific City, could be in the area of Coos Bay, abandoned area. There could be similar off-ramps for the internet. At this point, they aren't there yet, but it could be. It's sort of like you have a train tracks going through your county. They may not have a stop there yet, but they could at some point. And if you don't have the train tracks, you're never going to get a stop there. So financially, the cables, they aren't big employers. A lot of these data centers and whatnot don't really employ a huge number of people. Once a cable is put in, it's fairly automated. There isn't a lot of people associated with the landing stations, that sort of thing. But they do bring in revenue. There's typically, because cable owners want certainty, the state has allowed a provision to be excluded from their agreement, and that provision says something to the effect that if at some point in the legislature changes the law to allow the state to provide an assessment on cables, you as a cable company can buy that provision out so that it won't be in the agreement. So most cable companies want the certainty of a known entity, and they'd rather pay a few $100,000 up front that goes into the common school fund to know that there won't be some unknown assessment, for traffic down the road. States that have done that have they're not well thought of by the cable industry, obviously, when they keep raising the rate or the fee that they charge for transmission cables going through the area. So Oregon has a law, talking a little bit out of my area of real understanding, but my understanding is that in Oregon and public right-of-ways, the state at this time under state law cannot charge a fee. So if you're what's that? Counties can, and cities, municipalities can. But if it's a state right-of-way, I-5, you can put cables in there without a fee. And because it's state law, it could always be changed by the legislature. So that's why this thing. So there's typically some pretty big fees that are associated with buying out that class. John and then Bob? Bob and then John. Commissioner?
If you're thinking you're gonna get rich by having one of these terminals come in from overseas or something, think again, you would get a small portion of the revenue, because it's a portion wherever that company has a presence in any county in Oregon and any state. So you don't get all the value, let's say real property value, for your county under property taxes. It's all apportioned out through the utility, through the county revenue.
Scott, can you tell us how the agreement with the fishing industry works, including the financial parts?
Sure. So the agreement with the OFCC, we negotiate an agreement with each cable company. It's very standard and boilerplate, where it doesn't change from from company to company. The one that Microsoft signed is almost identical to what Google signed, almost identical to the one before, and the one before, and the one before. So really, not much change since the very first one went in. However, what minor changes are made apply to all because of the way we operate. If I think one thing that Google asked for, they said we can't. We just our bureaucracy in our company is so big, we cannot get an invoice turned around in 30 days, which is what we have as our policy. So they said we absolutely need 45 days. It's just the way we were. Sorry, we don't want to be late. We need 45 days. So when we gave Google 45 days, that applied to all of the companies. Microsoft was the next cable. They said, gosh, we need 60 days. So we changed it to 60 days for everybody. But as far as the fishing, we don't get any, we get a share, each company shares in the cost of the operation of the OFCC, paying my salary and my staff and our operational costs. The state doesn't get an annual fee or anything from the cable, nor we just get our operational budget is all. The fishing industry has a promise from the cable company that if a fisherman sacrifices a net to protect the cable, if for some reason he hangs up and he snags his net, maybe it's on the cable, maybe it's just so close that we can't rule it out, and he has to cut away his gear, that fisherman will get a replacement gear equivalent to what he has, new gear. Kevin has built a number of nets for, we've only had, I think, 7 cases in our 20-plus year history, but in the cases where a fisherman does sacrifice his gear, the committee pays for complete new gear, wire, cable, shackles, floats, everything that's involved. A new net now, particularly if it has electronics and a larger vessel, you could be talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. So cable owners are committed to replace gear, whatever the cost is.
So Kevin hasn't tried to go out there with empty cables and say that he lost his net?
We've had one case where we had someone lost their net someplace else, and then they tried to say, oh, I lost it near a cable, and the fleet really stood up and said, that's not the case. These guys trying to scam. They actually wanted to protect this setup. It's a good program, a very great program for legitimate things, and they were worried that a bogus claim would destroy that. So it actually came from within the industry.
Great, okay. Thank you.
Kevin?
I have Kevin, the Commissioner Yamamoto, and Patty. We are live. Scott, some questions from the audience just for education purposes.
I'll be brief. Just to bring up John's, I did get involved in landing a cable with the Iron Lady, and they did not bring the pipe out as far as they thought they did. So we had to go into the breakers and do a 3-point anchor, and it took a long time because it was the wrong time of year. So I've got them on both sides.
Thank you. Commissioner Yamamoto?
Thank you. Scott, thank you for being here. So Tillamook County has an intergovernmental agency called Tillamook Lightwave, and it's a combination of the county, PUD, and the Port of Tillamook Bay. And we have our own cable landing station in Pacific City, and we bring in cables from across the Pacific, and Scott's been very helpful there. I actually invited Scott into an executive session with Tillamook Lightwave. We didn't realize that everyone thinks the ocean is so vast, and yet we're ready to bring in more cables, and yet the routes coming into Pacific City, that area, are so limited right now. And you just don't think of the ocean being in terms of being limited as far as space goes. So working with Scott has been great. There are some fishing areas out there that may or may not be real fishing areas that Scott pointed out that we can't cross with a cable right now. So I think that's something that OPAC needs to look at the same time. I think it's important to bring these cables in from across the Pacific, and if there are areas that they can't cross because it's just an area of the ocean that's been identified that really is not utilized, maybe we need to rethink that at the same time. And I know Scott, you did a great job in that presentation, and we appreciate that so much.
Thank you.
Patty?
Kind of following up on that, how many cables, do we have an idea how many cables there are?
The way we count, we have 14 in Oregon right now, and one more on the way. Facebook signed agreement with us a couple months ago, and they're gonna put in a cable in the same city. So right now, 14 and one in the pipeline for next summer. We hear rumors about more, but that's all, at this point, that's all we have. 3 of those, as we count them, there's 2 cables that leave Pacific City and go to science installations in the Pacific. One goes way out to axial seamount, which is almost 300 miles offshore. And there's an active volcano there, and there's science nodes. And so 24 hours a day, there's data being collected at this volcano. And so it's pretty interesting. There's hydrothermal vents and stuff. And then there's another site called Hydrate Ridge on the second cable that also collects similar data. They have a camera that flips on multiple times a day. The lights come on, the camera comes on, and you can see this hydrothermal vent bubbling up methane and all the hot water species that have adapted to live in water that's boiling for what we would think. But because the 2 cables go offshore, one keeps going, the other one comes back on shore, we kind of consider that a 3rd cable. So that's how we come up with 14. Yeah. Sorry.
Scott, I apologize, I missed part of your presentation there, so you may have touched on this, but I was curious, with all the cables and this has been going on for a while now, and there's a lot of cabling going on the ocean floor. Has there been a bit of abandonment, or are there inactive cables, and are they able to be removed?
Yeah, the permits now give the state the ability to request removal. I believe that, I'm not sure how that would play out, whether that removal would apply to just state waters or throughout the fishing grounds. But in a lot of cases, we would sort of say that it's probably more disruptive to take it out if it's a well-buried cable. We don't see the need to. They're inert. They're when they're dark, there's nothing going through it. It could be abandoned in place. We did have one of our cable companies putting in the new Microsoft cable. Was crossing an existing cable that was out of service, the first cable that went in the 90s, and they actually, at our request, recovered 24 kilometers of that cable and brought it ashore to dispose of properly. I believe AT&T has plans to recover some of their cables off abandoned when they're out of service. So sometimes it's done. I think in the case of AT&T's, I'm not sure if they're planning on recovering the buried portion or just the portions that are on the surface. Some of the AT&T cables go across some really rocky, gnarly ground, and it wasn't able to be buried there, obviously. So they may pull that up and recover that, because that's easier to do than deep trenching. Probably more valuable from our environmental perspective to get that out.
So I guess, is there, for long-term planning, I mean, it's like you can't just put cables on the bottom forever, right? So has there been like I think about this with people sometimes with resources, but is there like a carrying capacity? Or you guys sort of project it out, like when it's too much in one area or another?
Well, I did mention before, but some of the technology now is evolving to where cables can be upgraded by replacing the boxes on the end. I gave an example of Google went in just a couple of years ago at 60 terabits per second, and they're already planning, or maybe have at this point even already, installed boxes to create that 60, turn it into 120 terabits. So just in a matter of a couple of years, double the capacity without anything in the water changing, just the devices and the ends.
We keep interrupting your presentation because I think it's exciting. Any questions?
It's in the presentation, so.
I certainly learned a lot. Are there other questions that we have about part 4?
Can I just make a point or two? I was remiss in adding the implementation requirements to the slides that Scott had. And depending upon if you are in state or federal waters, there's a different requirement for burial to the greatest extent practicable is the language. So I just did want to point out that does exist. And then there is a written description of the communication and coordination agreements that are expected. And then with DSL being the single point of contact to shepherd the process. So those are the only other points that I would add that I did not include in Scott's slides.
You did a great job, Andy. Thank you. I do think Oregon, this is an area that Oregon really does a good job and should be credited. Other states have been pointed at Oregon and say, go look at them. And so far only the people from Hawaii have done that, but other states clearly could take a lesson from Oregon.
Lauren?
That's Kevin's flag.
Oh, it is. Oh,
So-
Kevin, sorry.
I probably should know. Oregon's probably fairly attractive. I mean, Washington's too remote, isn't it?
Well, in terms of most of the internet traffic wants to go to Los Angeles. That's One Wilshire Boulevard is the center of the universe of the internet. And not all traffic's generated there, but most cables eventually work their way through One Wilshire Boulevard. The Oregon is attractive because of the way the regulatory regime here is efficient. The fishermen aren't trying to stop it as they do in other places, and probably rightly so. In Australia and New Zealand, they prohibit fishermen from fishing over cables. Here we say, have at it. As long as it's buried, help yourself. And so we've created this shared use of the seabed where other countries say, we have a guard boat ready to arrest you if you get fish over cable. So Oregon is mostly attractive. I think a lot of the cables that come ashore in Oregon are really trying to get to California. Washington, there's one of the things that makes Washington less attractive is there isn't any population hub on the coast. You really have to get to Seattle. And the second thing is the shelf, as you know, is wider off Washington. So you have a lot more cable burial, and then you have to get a right-of-way going all the way up to Seattle. So it's just a more complicated thing. And the tribal areas is another complication that makes for the sanctuary. All those things sort of work against Washington being a favorite place to locate.
Thank you. Richard?
It's a general cable question,
Yeah.
but when those things are at sea, how secure are the communications that go through them? Can they be tapped out?
I'm not sure. I've heard, originally I heard that they weren't very susceptible to being tapped, as the old analog were. The United States had developed a device on the old analog cable. They sent a submarine to attach a device on a cable between the Russian mainland and in a peninsula that had a military base on it. And the sub would go and replace the box every so often, and it would record the communications on that cable. That can't be done in the same way. Pulses of light, apparently, if there's a loss of light, they can detect that at the control rooms on each end of the cable. They can see there's a light leakage coming out of the pipe, so to speak. And I think they can, I've been told that they can actually tell to the meter how far that is from the station. You know, it's 3,961 meters from the station where we've got this light loss, and it's probably because there was a landslide and maybe the cable got bent a little bit, and so the light is diffusing into the water rather than continuing down that fiber. And that's a common break now. One of the most common breaks in the mid-ocean is an ocean landslide that parts the cable or kinks it enough that it. But so I can't answer. I have heard reports since that time that there is ways that people have developed to tap into cables. I think the decoding, I did hear one presentation that the trick is not that the cable is so hard to get to. It's the coding of the data going into the cable. So being able to turn that into something useful is a whole separate challenge, even if you can get the cable. That companies are using encryption in the digitizing of the laser.
I would assume in the event of, say, a global conflict, you can cut them.
Yeah,
and disrupt
absolutely.
them.
They're vulnerable, and one of the reasons our country likes to have a lot of cables is for security. When we first formed in 1998, we had suggested that there was one cable already installed at Pacific City. The second one was on its way, and we were, as fishermen, Terry Thompson and I and a fisherman by the name of Leo Coons, we were all concerned they're going to put, we're going to have to pick up and run over and pick up and run over, more cables. And so we said, why don't you just put them close together? And they said, what happened once on the East Coast is they had a number of cables out of, I think it was New Jersey, and they started going down one by one by one. And the people in charge, started seeing what was going on. AT&T was involved in almost everything at that stage. They thought it was the start of World War III. They thought an enemy is cutting our links to Europe one after one after one. And I think 7 cables got cut. Turned out it was a ship had left port, their anchor was dragging off the bow, they didn't realize it. Of course, the East Coast is real shallow, and so they were dragging up the coast, parting cables one by one, not having a clue this was going on. And here, it was creating panic at the Pentagon and where else. And it was just so they told us we don't want cables close together because of the risk of one event affecting multiple cables. So if you look at the landings we have in Oregon, they fan out pretty rapidly to go in different directions.
Although on security, we were just looking at the address that you gave, it's a little concerning that you could maybe just, in one building, affect our communication. Are there any other questions? Oh, Andy.
Yeah, Scott, I was hoping that you might be able to touch on requirements for cable maintenance ships to do the work that they do.
So when we formed in 1998, we kind of had this 3-page list of the things that we thought we as fishermen needed, and we were new to this, and we were still building the trust. We have a very trusting relationship now, but at the time we didn't. We were trying to protect our industry. So we said we wanted things like a hotline, a toll-free hotline that a fisherman could call 24 hours a day and be manned with somebody who can answer the phone and say yes. We didn't want to have a fisherman hang up in the middle of the night, call up and say, well, you have to wait until somebody comes in at 8 a.m. So we had that. We had the sacrifice gear fund so that a fisherman would be made whole if he sacrificed his net and to protect the cable. And the other thing that we had was we had a maintenance inspection requirement. We said after 5 years, after every 5 years, we want you to check the cable and see that it's still buried so that we can assure our fishermen that it's safe to fish there. It's a two-way street here. We're kind of going out and saying to the fishing fleet, you can safely fish over this buried cable, but please avoid this spot and this spot that are exposed, and all the rest it's buried. So we kind of felt like we needed to have an inspection to make sure that took place. We did the first set of inspections at 5 years, saw absolutely nothing that gave us any cause of concern. If it was buried to a meter before, it was still buried to a meter. We decided and agreed as a committee to extend the second inspection. If everything looked good at the first inspection, we'd extend the second one out to an 8-year interval, 8 years after that. And so that was fine. We did that for, we had some cables had a 13-year, a 5-year, and a 13-year inspection. And we've now, at our last board meeting, the board agreed to completely take off that requirement. As a group, we have said we have enough time now to look at this and look at all the information. We see no need. These are expensive things that it probably costs a cable company in the order of $80,000 a day to inspect a cable, and for what? Every time we do it, we find the same thing. Cable's still buried. So because the permit requirements have sort of incorporated this concept, one of the things that we have scheduled for this winter is to come back with a presentation to Department of State Lands and the agencies and say, here's what we found after all these inspections, here's what the costs are, we see no real benefit to that, and we would like the state to consider removing that requirement from the permits. We as a fishermen's organization for the OFCC agreement have removed it. I think, we're, most fishermen on our board are businessmen, and the cable, all of us understand there's no point really creating an unnecessary requirement. If there's really no value to it, let's take it away.
Susan?
Can I ask just a clarification? I was actually trying to get at some of the buffers that we as a group instituted for Part 5. So the cable ships are really big, right?
Mhm.
And they.
Oh, sure.
So if you could talk a little about
Yeah.
how much room it might take for them to do the maintenance, I think that's important for our discussion tomorrow, and I know you're not going to.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So when they inspect a cable, they have a big cable ship, several, probably 500 feet long, give or take, and they drop an ROV to the seabed. They have to be able to maneuver the ship in a way that's most favorable for that ROV. So unlike other vessels, the direction the bow is pointing is not necessarily the direction the ship's headed. It's got what's called dynamic positioning, thrusters controlled by computers that will let it walk sideways, backwards, any direction. So if the most optimal direction for the current is for the ROV to be on the starboard side, walking east, but the ship's bow should be to the northwest, that's the way they set it. And so you need a lot of room for the ship to maneuver and spin around and do what's necessary. So it doesn't lend itself to having other devices real close. There's what's called the ICPC guideline, the International Cable Protection Committee. It's an international body which our organization is now a part of, that sets kind of the standards for a lot of things, including how close cables can be spaced. And the standard is 3 times the water depth as a lateral buffer from cable to cable. And they figure that would give enough room, but when you get into shallow water, that really isn't enough on some cases. So in order to get cables in deeper water, they have to drop a grapple. ROVs only go down to about 2,000, 2,500 meters. So to get a deep cable to pick up, you need a lot of room to get your grapple down, get your lead right, and then drag across that cable and pick it up. So you need miles of space between cables in deep water. So it's relative to the depth, but you really need some space to work. Having an ocean energy field right next to a submarine cable or over a submarine cable would be really difficult. It would make it so it's unable to be maintained if you had a break.
Thank you.
Scott, I just had a question about California and their process, how it compares to Oregon as far as, I know it's fishermen down there too who have a similar committee set up to deal with these, but how is the process worked there, and roughly how many cables are there in California, if you know? Thank you.
I think Oregon probably has more cables right now, and I believe the total, I heard a quote recently from somebody that I believe knows, said that Oregon has about twice the capacity of California. Now, things are changing because one cable now at these new high capacity ones can make a huge difference in this balance, you know. And so California is getting a few new cables put in. Their process is, I think, more complicated. Their inspection regime, while they, like we have seen, they're extending the period between inspections. They're starting to see that there's not much value. And it looks like they're probably going to be moving the same direction to just sort of say, we don't think the inspections are really useful. As far as the fishing organizations down there, they, I would say they probably aren't as involved in sort of the planning of the cable. We work real extensively on the front end to try to get the cable in the best possible route for full burial. If we can get the cable well buried, then the fleet doesn't lose any fishing grounds. So that's where we put a lot of effort, is to make sure we get a good burial, good installation, and good soft mud. So, I don't know, did I answer the question?
Yep, thank you.
From your perspective, are there any, like, if you could wave a magic wand, are there any changes you want in Part 4, or is it working well?
Well, we will ask for a change to Part 4, I think, in terms of the periodic inspection. I think periodic inspection doesn't specify the period, but it does say periodic inspection. So I think that would be one thing that we would say. I believe, after being involved with this for a long time, I believe that submarine cables are a huge benefit to the state of Oregon. And so, I mean, I'm biased, it's what I do, but I think the things that we can do to continue to make Oregon an attractive place to land cables are good, good for the state, and you know, good for our country. Cables are sort of like freeways for data, and you know, we all want, you know, to pick up our phone and have data right away. We don't want to see the little wheel going around and around the lane, you know. And it's fiber optics that is allowing that. Whether you know, your cell tower is just the last piece of that distance. Most of that data is coming across the fiber optic link somewhere. Might not be transoceanic, but as the world evolves, you know, there's a lot more transatlantic, trans-Pacific traffic, global traffic.
And then I have one last question, and that is, in Part 4, it says that, that Part 4 applies to other utilities. Are there other utilities that are using Part 4?
We have, there are pipelines. There's ocean outfall pipelines, that sort of pipeline. There's no oil pipelines, for example, coming into the Oregon coast now. I personally doubt that we'll ever see an oil pipeline here. There could be some uses at some point in the really distant future. You know, if they found some way they wanted to harvest some of this methane in the deep ocean or something. That, I mean, it's not inconceivable that something could happen someday where pipelines could become more significant. But I don't see anything at all in near term. You know, probably we'll see a few more cables, but I don't see any huge changes.
Is your request still for new questions, or anyone else? All right, well, thank you, Scott, for your time and for driving to see us today. Appreciate it. I thought that was very fascinating.
You're welcome.
We're now gonna move into the public comment period for territorial C part 4. You may not wanna